Alright, in this video series we're going to talk about synthesizers. From first appearance, I know when I first started out and I didn't have any idea really what a synthesizer did, that it looked like this big huge thing that was so complex beyond comprehension that I was never, it was like, it's like, some of it looked like some stuff out of Star Trek, and I thought, wow, that's just too much, it's ridiculously complex. Well, what we're going to do in this series is we're going to talk about the simple concepts, as I usually do or try to, the simple concepts that, are used to create larger complexities. And so that's how we're going to look at the synthesizer, because from outward appearance, if you don't have any understanding of it, or even if you have an intermediate understanding or beginning understanding of it, that some of the things can seem very complex. Basically what you're dealing with is sound. So, if you've went back and watched the videos I've done on acoustics, timbres, and sounds and sound sculpting, that, some of those things, phase, those things that I've talked about, that we're basically dealing with, when we're talking about sounds, you might be talking about individual sinusoids sometimes, but most of the time you're dealing with more complex timbres. And, things that can happen with them: frequency modulation, volume modulation, low frequency oscillators that are going to change it and do things to it, different effects that can do it. But, without getting too complex into that, it's different things you can do with sound. You're either starting out with a timbre that's fairly well done that you're going to sculpt on, or you're starting out from scratch from separate sinusoids that you're going to build timbres, and you're going to do different things with whatever parameters are available to you in that synthesizer. So, that's a real basic way to see it, so that you can approach the concepts of what can be done with a synthesizer or a sampler, in a way that doesn't get, overwhelming, looking at some synthesizers, looking like it's like Jiminy Christmas. It's really complex. But the basic concepts that make larger complexities when you're doing those things are how we're going to go about looking at it. Because basically, with an understanding of those basics, then you're able to say, well, I'm trying to create this type of a sound. So what is in that sound? When you think about that sound, and it comes to your mind, what kind of properties does that sound have? And then being able to relate that to the synthesizer or the sampler or whatever type of synthesis tool you're using, to be able to apply those properties of that sound that you've heard or that you're thinking up in your mind, how you're going to apply those properties to that, and the timbre construct of it, what is it relating to? And the more you understand sound, you understand the difference between a drum hit that would be closer to an explosion, things that might be happening in this explosion, and that's a real basic example. Or, any type of sound, what can you relate it to some other sound that you're familiar with, and the timbres that it's constructed with to help you synthesize or starting from scratch, or building on something that's already, you have a sample of to work with. And so we're going to kind of look at it that way, so that in this series that we're going to really go down to the basic concepts of it and build out on it, the complexities that can arise from that. And then I'm thinking at the end of this that we'll actually do some actual sound sculpting and, lay out some, things that, how some things can be constructed, to get you started looking at different constructs to make different types of sound or to sculpt different types of sound, and how far you can take those to become realistic and natural as you want them to be for the production you're working in. So let's take a look at synthesis on Wikipedia. Alright, so before we go on, my recommendation, if you really want to understand what's going on with them, is that, it's dealing with sound. So if you have no understanding of sound at all, that, I don't know how far you're going to get without it being very frustrating. So, you're going to have to make a decision how much you want to understand about sound to understand what a synthesizer is and what it's doing. But on my channel, I've got some videos, and I recommend you come back watching this video on phase, complex and polar waveforms, noise and distortion, sound sculpting, harmonic harmonics, timbre harmonics, distortion, non-harmonic distortion, timbre of instruments. This one here on sound sculpting, these on spectral content shaping. There's one here on saturation, shaping your saturation. There's another one here on stereo field. That's another one that can be very helpful. There's a series here on learning audio engineering that is going to directly be, some of the content can be very much directly related into what's happening in the actual synthesizer. Acoustics is another one, a series that I put together that will be really helpful. And there's one on here that's basic music theory, and it's not, I didn't put that one together for you to become a theoretician, you know, but it gives you the basics so that you can understand how most of the concepts in when you're dealing with something like a synthesizer or the audio, that the basic musical concepts that are applied to that and how they relate. So I suggest you go back and take a look at those videos to give you a little bit better understanding of what you're dealing with, so that as you learn about the synthesizers here, that you have a little bit better understanding of the sound. Alright, so hopefully that you went back and watched those videos and you have a much better understanding of sound and you know how it is put together and basically what it is. So, you know, I'm hoping you did. And if you didn't, as we go along through this, that hopefully those things should be fairly well addressed. But if you run into questions and we're talking about something, you can probably go back to those videos and get a direct answer from them, or they'll direct you somewhere that should answer your question fairly well, give you some good direction. So we've only gone to Wikipedia here, and we're going to go through it, and we're going to address this from this perspective and branch out from this, you know, like a tree. We're going to kind of branch out a little bit on a synthesizer and just kind of look around what it is. So let's just start out with, you know, what's it saying a synthesizer is? A synthesizer is an electronic musical instrument that generates electrical signals. And if you went back and watched those videos I did on analog and digital signals, that you've probably got a pretty good understanding of that, and the videos I did on acoustics, that are converted to sound through instrument amplifiers, loudspeakers, or headphones. Synthesizers may either imitate instruments like piano, Hammond organ, a flute, vocals, or any type of sound like that, ocean waves, effects, I mean, all kinds of different sounds. Or it can generate new electric timbres, meaning that you can create timbres from scratch to create whatever kind of sound that you want. They're often played with a keyboard, you know, just a normal keyboard on a keyboard, on a synthesizer that has a keyboard built into it. Or they can be controlled with other types of input devices like music sequencers, instrument controllers, fingerboards, guitar synthesizers, wind controllers, electronic drums, things like that. And synthesizers without built-in controllers are often called sound modules. And we've talked about sound modules in some of the other videos, but we'll talk about them again. And are controlled via MIDI or CV gate using controller devices, often a MIDI keyboard or other controller. So that's fairly self-explanatory, but just on first view, some of those things might need to be looked at a little bit differently, or a little bit deeper, I should say. So let's kind of take a look at that and see what things we probably need to clarify. Okay, so the first thing, that most of these things are pretty easy to understand. If you watch that video series that I did on MIDI, you probably got a pretty good understanding of music sequencers and instrument controllers. Fingerboards, I'm not going to get into that. Some of them can be kind of different, and you can research that if you want, but I'm not going to at this point. Guitar synthesizers and wind controllers are basically the same concept of either a guitar or some type of wind instrument that's been converted into something that's going to actually reproduce or act as a synthesizer. And electronic drums is the same. They're just electronic drums are set up to trigger, something that's drums that are set up and connected to things like sound modules or synths themselves. Sound modules, we've talked about sound modules before, and basically the sound module is going to be something that has no controller surface that's triggered by some type of controller. Controlled sound module through a sequencer, which is a computer hardware or software designed to record and play back the control information for sound generating hardware or things like sound modules. So that's very easy to understand, and that basic concept, so that we understand what that is. It's a synthesizer, or it's a sampler that doesn't have any control. There has to be controlled by either keyboard or sequencer or some type of software, which that, brings us right back to the end part of it, where it's controlled by either MIDI or a CV gate. CV gate's real easy. Is that it's an analog method of controlling synthesizers and drum machines and other similar equipment with external sequencers, which we've just talked about. And if you've watched that video series, like I said, about MIDI, you probably got a pretty good understanding of what a sequencer is anyway. So we won't really get into that too much, and we will probably address that quite a bit as we go through this series. The next thing we want to talk about is actual types of synthesis. Alright, so what types of synthesis are we dealing with? Let's just see what it says there. It says synthesizers use various methods to generate electronic signals. Among the most popular waveform synthesis techniques are subtractive synthesis, additive synthesis, wavetable synthesis, frequency modulation synthesis, phase distortion synthesis, physical modeling synthesis, sample-based synthesis, some various other types of synthesis, things like granular synthesis. So basically what we want to do is we kind of want to go through there, and the next step would be to actually address the various different types of synthesis, which we're going to do in the next video. But to end this video, basically, we addressed, the synthesizer and basically what it is. And basically, the initial understanding is you have a control surface and some type of either hardware or software that's synthesizing sound or sculpting sound, or it's, sampled sound and playing back sampled sound in various different ways. And how many of those different ways, we might not get into a lot of them. We're just basically trying to address synthesis. So you have to excuse me if I don't go off into 50 videos on different types of controllers and ways to produce synthesis. We just want to basically look at the basic synthesizer and the basic components and concepts to build larger complexities so that we're able to work with them. So I hope you enjoyed the first video, and we're going to get started on the next video on different types of synthesis.